I would like to welcome you to our seminar today. This is PoSoCoMeS seminar series. When you are talking about books, they are concerned about the topics of post-socialist things like memory or politics for different disciplines. Today we have a book from Ekaterina Haskins. And the title of the book is Remembering the War, Forgetting the Terror, Appeals to Family Memory in Putin's Russia. It was published 2024 by Penn State University Press. And our discussant today is Elizaveta Gaufman. Our other discussant, Alexandra Yatsyk, unfortunately can't join us today. Ekaterina Haskins is a professor of rhetoric and visual studies at Pennsylvania State University, and her research and teaching encompass political rhetoric, memory studies, and visual culture. And in the recent time, her scholarships is about to investigate the rhetoric and politics of public memory in Russia and post-Soviet countries. It's just a post-Soviet Union or other countries like Poland or Czech Republic as well?
I'm primarily focusing on post-Soviet republics, but of course, the general context of the post-Soviet and post-socialist politics and culture is a relevant thing. Yeah, I mean, it's still kind of a work in progress, so we'll see where it takes me.
You are also a recipient of multiple awards, and you have published a lot of articles. And I have monograph about popular memories, commemoration, participatory culture, and democratic citizenship. The 15. It was really interesting combination of topics. And Elizaveta Gaufman, our discussant today, is an assistant professor and in the Research Center for the Study of Democratic Cultures and Politics at the University of Groningen. And your research is situated in intersection of political theory, international relations, media, and cultural studies. It's also a really wide field of topics that you are searching for your studying. And you are the author of Security Threats and Public Perception that was published 2017, as I can see. Katja, I think you would like to start to talk about your book first. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alina. Thank you for your introduction. Thank you to all of the participants for showing up on the day of Trump's inauguration. I know that that spectacle is very fascinating. And so I appreciate your attention to my work and to the topic of the seminar. So, and thank you for supporting PoSoCoMeS. This organization has become really kind of my intellectual home in the last couple of years. And in fact, Lisa advised me to attend one of the conferences. And so the first time I went to a PoSoCoMeS conference was in Tallinn in 2023 and met a lot of fascinating scholars from across different disciplines who are interested in the same topic. And so I think it's a very wonderful platform, and it's kind of rare for a division of a larger organization to have a monthly seminar where people can actually meet in between larger conferences, annual conferences. So I think this is a terrific venue, and I'm very pleased to be a part of it. So my book, as Alina mentioned, the title is Remembering the War, Forgetting the Terror, Appeals to Family Memory in Putin's Russia, is about not only about the resurgence of the cult of the Great Patriotic War under Putin, but also the kind of amnesiac attitude toward the traumatic or politically repressive Soviet past. And I argued these are intertwined trends in memory politics, and that these trends are not only the product of Putin's politics of memory or state-supported memory industry, but also attachments that are much more latent, and habits of memory, and also familial piety that are more sort of bottom up and internal, that drive or allow this cult of the Great Patriotic War to have so much power in Russia, even after the invasion of Ukraine, where the contrast between the mission, the Soviet Union's mission in World War II, and the reality of the invasion of Ukraine are so starkly different. So nonetheless, this myth, this cult of the Great Patriotic War has been one of the sort of pillars on which the rhetoric of justification of the invasion of Ukraine rests. And so I finished the book before, most of the book before the invasion, before February 22. And so it was kind of sad to me, and unfortunately, real life events only confirmed the argument that I made in the book. And so the book is structured around case studies. I examine different places and different vehicles of memory that have shaped people's attachment to the certain particular narrative of the Great Patriotic War, and a particular way of thinking about it. And that is the idea of self-sacrifice, patriotic self-sacrifice, that is the highest model of citizenship, right? And so this is something that as a child growing up in the Soviet Union, we all kind of imbibed and internalized through all sorts of media, especially movies, but also museum visits, visits from veterans, and so on. And so I talk about this kind of habituating force of really popular media on the imagination of spectators, and also how this latent repertoire of attitudes toward the Soviet past gets reproduced in things like popular marches, like the Immortal Regiment, that is the subject of another chapter, and how people's bodily participation really kind of reinforces the idea of the triumph and the victory and the righteous cause of the war, and how this becomes a kind of almost nostalgia for the Soviet past that can be exploited by the government, as it was, because the Immortal Regiment, even though it began as a kind of grassroots initiative, it was overtaken by the state, by the United Russia Party, and became a tool for government's propaganda. However, well supported by the population, right? And I also talk about habituation as a kind of spatial phenomenon, where we get exposed to not just particular representations of Stalin, for example, in public spaces like statues or images, but also we're surrounded by the built environment that reminds people of the golden age of Stalinism, that even if they're not paying attention to it, it still kind of remains in the backdrop and provides this sort of grounds for thinking about the Soviet past in this very kind of rosy glasses kind of fashion. And obviously, family memory is also a very important phenomenon here, because family memory has come to the front of remembrance and the politics of remembrance in Putin's Russia, where familial piety, that we must respect our elders, we must respect our ancestors, is now used as an argument for forgetting the terrible parts of the Soviet past, for not trying to dig up the traumatic past, not trying to publicize it. So, in particularly political repressions, even though a lot of families had the experience of both war and terror in their own families. And I use some of my biographical information about my family, my mother's family, to show how really repressions were something that families really did not talk about during the Soviet era. And even now, there is reluctance to broach this topic. So there's a kind of a mythical logic that has to do more with duties and taboos that are hard to question. So they're not logical in the rational sense. They're commitments and attachments and pieties that can be exploited by the state, right? And I finish the case studies with a look at the digital realm. I look at both official and grassroots digital archival projects to show how it's really, really difficult to even families who have documents and stories to share about their ancestors who took part in the war, how difficult it is for them to store that would be unique, that would actually reflect some traumatic episodes of their lives, even if they survived the war. So they're kind of compelled to adhere to a very formulaic, pre-formatted template, even when you have more sort of grassroots efforts to do that. So, and there's also another aspect that I don't really dwell on that much, but there's also emphasis on the war experience as a very masculine kind of experience. It's the experience of men. It's about heroic war deeds. It's about combat, right? So even though initiatives like the Immortal Regiment are trying to be inclusive and invite people to carry portraits of their ancestors, regardless of the extent of their participation in the war. So they invite people who were children of war, survivors of the Leningrad siege, POWs, right, people who got captured. Nonetheless, the rhetoric of heroic deeds is something that really shapes the narrative, even on this grassroots level. And you see this with the Immortal Regiment's online digital project, where they're trying to collect stories from families. So essentially, I'm arguing that even though many families do have experience of both war and terror, on the whole, as a population as a whole, they're more inclined to stick to the triumphalist, nostalgic narrative of the war and the past as a kind of a golden age of the country, and to avoid discussions of political persecution, or when they do broach the subject, they're considered to be sort of the negative variant of family memory. And so those cases where a person would not only research their ancestors' fate, but also publicize that research, have become highly controversial. So the case of Denis Karagodin, a Siberian man who traced the fate of his great-grandfather who was shot in the late 30s, and he traced the chain of command all the way up, identified his executioners, identified people who were shot together with him. So that became kind of a big scandal, a debate, and it kind of shows you that when you go against that taboo, that you are viewed as someone who is transgressing, someone who is kind of stepping on very, very touchy, right? Very touchy, but also very sensitive issues. So this book ends mostly with spring 22 because simply I couldn't really keep going and doing more research. So my publisher wanted me to turn in the manuscript. So, but obviously the topics that I bring up continue to reverberate. The International Memorial was shut down in late 21, as we know, and the invasion began in February, very few weeks later. So these iconic sort of moments of history are deeply, deeply connected. So I'm curious to see how the politics of memory continues to work both within and outside the Russian borders, how people take up the memory of repressions when there are especially communities, Russophone communities abroad, how they now have taken up the memory of repressions as a way to oppose the war, to express their anti-war sentiment as they are making a home, a temporary home in Europe and elsewhere. So I'm going to stop here, and I hope that whatever questions or things that I haven't touched on can be answered during the discussion.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. Lisa, would you like to give your comments on the book and your questions for Katya?
Yes.
Thank you.
So hi, everyone, and thank you for being here. I know we're a tough competition with the inauguration. I first actually wanted to show Katya's book, which has this really I would say haunting cover, but I think I've used the word haunting a lot when I was talking about her book. But I think it also showcases and sort of gives a bit of a taste for what is to come in the book as well. And for those of you who are familiar with the commemoration context in Soviet Union or post-Soviet Russia, you know why the red carnations are there. Because this is also, like if you see a red carnation in a post-Soviet Russian context, you know exactly why it's there and why it's on the cover. So it's kind of I guess, a bit of a dog whistle for those who are in the know, but it also shows the kind of different layers, also the post-Soviet memory actually functions. And so I also want to say that, full disclosure, I was actually one of the first sort of outside readers of this manuscript, because the publishing house actually contacted me to review the book before the publication. And when I saw Katya's name, I immediately said yes, even though I was overloaded with other tasks, because I was familiar with Katya's previous work. And I obviously cited her in my publications. And so, but I was wondering at the same time, what was there new to say about memory, honestly, because it was, I think it was the year 22 or maybe 23 already. And I've been working on memory studies since 2013. So I couldn't really imagine what there was something like an innovative way of actually approaching post-Soviet and especially Putin's memory politics. But I have to say, Katya proved me wrong in many ways. And I would also just want to highlight the real innovative way that Katya approached the research on memory politics. I'm sorry that Alexandra Yatsyk is not here, who would have probably spoken a lot about the biopolitical context of memory, and her own work is also very much in literature. But for me, I think that the methodological innovation was the most valuable part. And Katya briefly mentioned some of the chapters in the book, and I have to say the chapter that really blew me away when even on the reviewer stage was chapter number 2, where Katya was talking about the Immortal Regiment and how she participated, how she walked, how she marched with the members of the Immortal Regiment. Because to my knowledge, I may be wrong, but to my knowledge, it was the first time that somebody actually attempted to do an autoethnography of this kind of event, also with a background in sort of having grown up with some of these effects, also ingrained effects in many ways, but also trying to reflect on them in a critical way. And I think that this kind of policy that Katya talks in the book about, sort of the shaping of public affect. And this is something that we can see very clearly throughout the, well, I would say not just as post-Soviet Russia, but also the Soviet Union policies. Like, shaping of public affect is really an integral part of creating a community and creating citizens and shaping citizens' attitudes towards the authorities. And so when I was reading that book, and also that specific chapter, which, by the way, my students are going to read in next month as well, because I think that this is really an invaluable resource to approach memory politics from a really embodied perspective, the really personal perspective, and sort of explain it to the people who might not be growing up with this kind of experiences, who might not be even have any kind of attachment to any type of even World War II memories altogether, but just to give them an idea how skillful this shaping of public affect can actually function. And this is something that, again, Katja points out in the book that this was a grassroots initiative, something that people actually wanted to do by themselves. And there's some literature on immortal regiment about, like sort of trying to even like this necropolitics and stuff like that. But what I think is important in Katja's work here is that it shows that you cannot help but actually give in to this effect. Because, and this is something that also might be related to the research on crowds and sort of emotional contagion, but it's very, very hard to resist this kind of emotional and affective pull that those communities might have over you. And this is something that the government obviously tried during the pandemic. They also tried to still kind of maintain this community building through online practices. But I think that Katja also shows that this kind of community, offline community, this marching together and feeling together is something that is very hard to replicate. And this is why the Russian government values this kind of practices so much. And this is also probably why these practices have been somewhat low-key discontinued after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, because this kind of affect management does not always work to the government's advantage. And I think that that's why you cannot really see Immortal Regiment marches all over Russia in the context of the full-scale invasion, because the government might not be entirely sure where the effect will take the people. And also that Katja really shows the limits of the management part of the effect throughout this chapter as well. I would also say that the part about the ambient Stalinism, so this kind of really sort of background existence of certain memories, something that you just unconsciously do. So this is something that a lot of researchers have also emphasized the importance of this kind of unconscious choices, so everyday actions that you might not be even consciously doing, something that's already exists there without your conscious knowledge. I think that's also a very important part that also is connected to my field of international relations, where we talk about this everyday turn. So people talk about the everyday experiences of international relations. And in this case, we talk about the like World War II is obviously international relations event. It's a war. It's a war against a very powerful adversary. It's a lot of very important national relations topics that are obviously still relevant now. And so, what it makes this book actually even more relevant for scholars outside of memory studies and Slavonic studies, Eurasian studies, and the kind of fields that you would think that this book would be relevant to in the first place. And I think that by juxtaposing the war and terror, Katja really presents a really good and persuasive case for the ambience of memory and its prosthetic quality. So this kind of prosthetic quality also, I thought it was such a great metaphor when we're dealing with memory. And also, just a side note, the book is really well written. So it's honestly a pleasure to read. And it's very easy to follow in many ways. And also, you are really transported in many ways in a lot of cases when you read the book. So this kind of prosthetic quality is also something that I was wondering in the context of the full-scale invasion, is also kind of moving on to the kind of questions that I would have for Katja. Is prosthetic memory enough now in the context of the full-scale invasion? Because we know that that Putin has been really consciously trying to connect the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the memory of World War II in the Russian context. And in the last several of his addresses on the Victory Day, he also specifically mentioned that these are the veterans of World War II, and like the soldiers who are fighting in Ukraine right now are doing sort of the same thing. So I was wondering, actually, from a Katja perspective, this is my kind of question for the discussion as well, whether the prosthetic quality is enough now. So whether there are obviously some people who do go and join the Russian army. So there are people who obviously support the war, or at least support the fighting in the war, and obviously gleefully engage in war crimes, essentially. So I was wondering if this kind of prosthetic memory is something that should be taken into consideration in this context. So are they not content with having a prosthetic memory and they want the real life memory of the war? Do they want to feel like their grandpas, or probably in this case already great grandpas? They want to feel connection to the war. They don't want the ambient part. They want the real life part. And whether this is actually something that should be researched to an extent when we talk about the current Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and whether this kind of prosthetic quality would also be relevant for other post-Soviet states. Because when we talk about, let's say, Kazakhstan, where there are also a lot of monuments for the for World War II. And again, it's also very often called Great Patriotic War, like it was called in Soviet Union and it is called in contemporary Russia. So whether this is it's a similar or it's a different kind of prosthetic memory. Is it the similar or different ambient memory of Stalinism? And for example, in the context of Kazakhstan, there are also camps. There are labor camps. There are camps, for example, for the wives of the traders of the motherland. So how would the places of memory, so to use Pierre Norat's terminology, the lieu de mémoire, so how these places of memory could be also contrasted with the way the memory politics would work in a different context that is not beholden to Putin's memory politics. But altogether, I would say, even though it's a very sad read, but at the same time, it's extremely reflexive. It's very analytical, and it gives this really interesting spin on the memory studies and the way we even approach memory politics in many ways. So I did not really talk a lot about forgetting the terror. And this is also something that I've discussed with my students, and I hope that we will discuss also this semester with the students, how the forgetting also is supposed to be integrated into the remembrance. So this is something that we can go back all the way to Ernest Renan, when he talked about, like, you have to forget the night where we slaughtered all those Protestants, the St. Bartholomew's night. Otherwise, we cannot have like a memory of the good French nation. So what needs to be forgotten in this context to create sort of a nation? And whether and by forgetting and by creating a certain type of prosthetic memory, what does that do to the future generation in many ways? And given the digital context that we live in, where we can actually click on somebody's memories that might have been unavailable during the Soviet era, whether this will actually make a difference? Will people even want to click? And I guess it's more of a philosophical question and something that we cannot really answer at the moment. But would shaping of public affect, would the qualities of prosthetic memory be different in the more digitized context, where people would be more aware of the fact that of living in an authoritarian state? So thank you very much for letting me talk about Katya's book. I wholeheartedly recommend it. And I think it's also a great resource for students who approach the region and studying Russia and kind of trying to understand the context of the war and its legitimation in the Russian government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Katya, would you like to answer the questions at the moment?
Yes, and let me start with the book, actually, even though it's not a question, but I just wanted to clarify the sort of the genesis of the book cover, and I received it from the publisher, and it was pretty much what you see now. And my question was to them, like, how did you come up with this? You know, where did these images come from? And so the designer said that this is a composite image, not only because there are carnations at the top and kind of this smoky, foggy war-like scene at the bottom, but also the image at the bottom is a composite image. So, and apparently this was taken from some stock footage of a reenactment, a battlefield reenactment. And so this is, and I thought perfect because it is not a documentary photograph of World War II. It is a reenactment of the kind of things that we imagine like from movies and so forth. And so reenactment is actually, and I don't talk about this genre or this specific side of memory. Reenactments are very, very popular in contemporary Russia. And, I wonder to what extent this is something that young men who do decide that this is a good thing to do, is to join the special military operation. This is their imagination of what war is like. So it is a kind of prosthetic memory in a way, but it also is embodied, right? And, I would be curious to, and I don't know, it would be hard for me to do this kind of research because I do not intend to travel to Russia anytime soon, at least until the conflict is over. But yes, it would be interesting to find out from returning veterans of the war, and somebody probably will do this kind of research of what their stories are like. And I imagine that at this point, it is not safe for people to discuss their experience, wartime experience, as part of a special military operation. And there's probably lore. There are things that people talk about in private or in close circle of friends. But yeah, that is a big question. And of course, we saw more or less the same thing happening after veterans were returning from the front in the Soviet Union, right, from the war. So there are very searing biographies and memoirs of front fighters, but there are not that many of them. And so for the most part, people who came back were severely traumatized, and those who survived did not talk about the war experience. When their loved ones asked them about this, they would either not talk, or if they were invited to talk to school children, they would often fall back on cliches and stories from books and movies. So it is something that there's a kind of gap between the trauma, the experience, and the way that we talk about it. And so a lot of times what we are able to say or narrate is based on available templates. And so it's kind of part of the prosthetic memory, right? And this is how we get to imagine not just something that we did not participate in, but also even our own experiences. So that's kind of the trick of memory, right? That as something that is reproduced, created and reproduced in the present. So yeah, so that's kind of soldiers in Ukraine. Is prosthetic memory enough? I don't know. Like I really have no idea. From what I can imagine, in terms of the media that people of that generation consumed, obviously they were exposed to more sort of blockbuster style movies about World War II. So like T-34, Stalingrad, right? And these films are definitely loud, much louder versions of their quiet Soviet predecessors, where it's like no gray areas, right? It's very black and white. It's very, very much focused on masculine war prowess, right? So in Stalingrad, we see these like ballets of violence, of hand-to-hand combat, of men who are engaged in this, very, very physical, like close combat. And I think that is part of the aesthetic, for the lack of a better word, that conveys the ideal, not just self-sacrifice, but also masculinity. And again, this is not the topic that I, dive into for the most part, but it's an important element of how a particular image of frontline soldier is constructed in popular imagination. And it is definitely something, a manly act, right? And I think from what I've seen on social media and also coverage of present day advertising for joining the military, they would juxtapose the figure of a man who is working as a guard at the store, as a security guard, and then he's transformed in the image next to it into a frontline fighter, right? And so there's a kind of elevation, a status elevation, right? And the promise of, if you return, you will be given a special status. So of course, it's mostly a lie. We know that returning veterans in the Soviet Union, even though many of them did participate in sort of leadership positions, but a lot of the veterans were not endowed with a special status. And there was the rhetoric of that, and sometimes they were given rations. But I think that the leitmotif of the complaint of veterans who were actual people in the late Soviet was that they were really neglected by the state, that they lived in really cramped apartments. They did not see the attitude that they have earned, they thought they have earned. And so I think that there's a continuity in the rhetoric of, like, if you go to war, you're going to be a real man, and you will get all of these things once you come back. And of course, now with the kind of financial incentive model, where families get a lot of money that they've never seen before, if their father or brother or whoever goes to the front and dies, they get the coffin money, so to speak. And so that seems to be this very bizarre necropolitics, where people actually enjoy a higher standard of living because their loved one died, and so that's kind of a very sad, very morally devastating, I think, moment in contemporary Russian life, right, where a whole sort of swath of the population is seeing this as a kind of benefit. Yeah. So it's kind of, it's weird mix of the rhetoric of self-sacrifice and sacrifice as something sacred. And in fact, we see Patriarch Kirill, who said that any soldier who gives his life in the context of this war will be forgiven all the sins. So there is actually, the church is also blessing this endeavor, and gives extra kind of sanctity to the role. So there's, it's a continuation of the Soviet rhetoric, but there are also like other aspects that are being emphasized: masculinity, sacrality, and so forth, that possibly give reasons for men to join. So when you talk about other post-Soviet states, I have not made my way to Kazakhstan, and this is on my wish list. Certainly a lot of things to explore there, and a lot of sites of memory, and of course the camps are important. I was in Georgia in the fall, and so I was kind of wondering about the lingering presence of Soviet era sites of memory, and of course there's the Gory Museum, which is the birthplace of Stalin, and that's been made into a shrine after his death. And and there's also kind of this ambient Stalinism that has very little to do with historic Stalin, but it's more like a Stalin myth, right? There are socks depicting Stalin, so you can see at souvenir stands socks with hinkali, like the little dumplings, and next to dumplings is Stalin. So Stalin is a kind of homey kind of national pride type of person. So it's slightly different from the Russian version, where he's portrayed as the architect of the victory and the architect of the golden age. In Georgia, it's more sort of domesticated Stalin, so to speak, right? And so there's a kind of lingering and also like re-sanctification. There was a big scandal when one of the big churches in Tbilisi had a mural of Stalin on its ceiling among the saints, and so it created a huge uproar, and they removed it. So Georgians are obviously not of one mind about Stalin, but there's this sort of fascination, I think, with the character, with the kind of it's almost like Napoleon to the Corsicans, right? And he is the son of Georgia, so it becomes a kind of like a trading card. Like, you know, Georgia is great because Stalin is the most famous Georgian. And in fact, when I was booking my plane ticket, you get offers from tourist agencies that are trying to hook you up with different tours. And the Gori Museum was advertised as the birthplace of the most famous Georgian on, American tourist booking sites. So yeah, I mean, we're dealing with the legacy of the Soviet era in the form of monuments and memorials and museums, and also like lingering myths, right, that get exploited both politically and commercially. And so it's something that hasn't quite gone away. Maybe it got transformed in certain ways, and that's kind of the thing about sites of memory. They're not meaningful in and of themselves. They're only meaningful insofar as people use them, communities use them in a particular way. And I think that the point you make, Lisa, about the crowdedness, like the experience, offline experience of people who are commemorating together, such in the ritual, like if they're gathering around some kind of memorial, or marching in the streets, there's a sense of the vitality of memory, and the sense that you are, I mean, it is a spontaneous or creation of the community of memory. And we know, of course, from memory literature, no one remembers in isolation, right? Like, we need others to share and to buttress, and also give us a sense of belonging. So I think that this is relevant both for memories of the war, but it's also relevant for memories of Soviet terror, and also how memories of Soviet terror might be energized by what is going on now. So, and I think it is happening. And I think the Russian state knew that. So when banning gatherings, large gatherings at the Solovetsky stone in Lubyanka, right? This was the site of returning the names, which is an annual ritual that's still going on, but you cannot gather there as a huge crowd from 10 in the morning to 10 at night. And I was actually there, I think it was the last gathering in 2019, when I specifically went there to remember my great-grandfather was a priest, and he was killed by the Bolsheviks very soon after the October Revolution. And of course, the family almost never talked about it. And this is kind of something I mentioned in the book, that my family is an example of trying to hide, to mute that information, not only because they thought it was, they didn't know much about what happened, like the specifics, but also they didn't want to harm the chances of their family members if they were applying for jobs, or going on to apply to university. So not knowing was a safe strategy. And now I think people are, I wouldn't speak for the whole population. Obviously, there are different attitudes to commemorating individual victims of terror. and the way that they should be commemorated. So projects like Returning the Names and The Last Address that celebrated in December are, I think, a new way that seems to be more effectively potent than simply doing research or putting names in databases. And I think that's kind of the thing about prosthetic memory, or whatever you call it, unless it's actualized in some kind of communal context, it's not as powerful. And so this is where we see the most uptake and the most energy going, is when we see people gathering together offline. And so I don't know. And what needs to be forgotten? That's a very good question. And I think that we will be pondering that in the coming years and decades, right? To what extent bad, dark spots of the Soviet past should be some information, or some stuff should be kind of left alone. I mean, not much has been done, and so I think we're kind of going through another circle, right? And I think this time, people who are memory activists and who are trying to keep the memory of Soviet terror alive, so to speak, and promote research and so forth, they also understand that without broader public participation and kind of more embodied, more emotionally charged rituals, it's not going to be a very popular project, right? And so I recall Arseny Roginsky's, it's like a farewell documentary. Of course, no one knew that he would pass very soon, but this was a conversation that was recorded with him in 2018, I believe, not long before his death, when he said that despite all the work that Memorial has done, it has not penetrated mass consciousness. And so people, even people who have repressed relatives, still do not think of them as victims of the state, right? So there's this kind of understanding that our state is the greatest, right? Like there is still a belief that what was done maybe was a tragic mistake, but this was not, the state cannot be brought to justice. That, there is this very kind of almost infantile belief in the fathers, right, and the national father figures. So yeah, and so people think of it as some, repressions were like the plague. We were living our lives, and then suddenly the plague, and it killed a lot of people, and then it went away, and we continued living our lives. And so it's a very kind of state of affairs that we have to reckon with, and to understand that this is sort of the baseline, right? And the ways that projects like The Last Address are really kind of energizing participation is by appealing to people's sense of like, what would you like? It's identification, right? It's not thinking about huge masses of people or particular operations, whatever, but like in terms of human beings who were taken from their last address, right? So the last address is a plate that is attached to the wall, the facade of the wall of a building where a person lived and was taken away to camp or to be shot. And that is something that is grassroots, that people apply to install this plate. And a lot of times these people are not relatives. They are acting out of some other kind of impulse. Sometimes it's spatial sympathy, right? Where a person wants to install a plaque for someone who lived on the same street or in the same building that they are occupying now. So it's a kind of putting yourself in the shoes of that long gone stranger, right? So, and I think it's an ethical decision, right? Unlike unlike family obligation that is operating under the mythical logics of taboos and duties, right? This is a kind of an ethical decision, it's an ethical choice. And I think that, I mean, there is a future in that project, I think, even though now it's under threat. A lot of plates have been removed, but people will go and restore them with cardboard replicas, even, you know, when they cannot make a metal one quickly. So it's a sign of kind of vitality and emotional charge of this project. And also returning the names has fractured, but it has not disappeared. And so I found it very moving to watch the stream on October 29th, where multiple cities in Russia and in Europe and elsewhere in the United States, Australia, had gatherings of people who read the names of complete strangers as well as their relatives, and also read letters from current political prisoners in Russia. So there's a kind of both offline and online community of memory that is active, and is also, now this seems to be the site that allows people to find others after they've been displaced and moved to a different country. Like, and also maybe sometimes, as I think one Russian speaking man in Estonia said, that this is our chance to create a common platform, common space of memory with Estonians who, you know, are wary of the whole sort of Russian victory in World War II rhetoric, right? So yeah, it's a kind of project that speaks to the vitality of memory as the product of collective action, that is repetitive, that is connected through other media. So I think one of the questions from Alexandra was about digital memory, and if that's enough, right? Like, is it enough to have a database or even like a more interactive kind of forum? And I would say that it's important to have one, but it's not enough to have that kind of affective participation and spatial co-presence that really allows us to feel that memory, whatever we're remembering together. So.
Thank you very much. Lisa, do you have another question for Katya, or can we open the discussion to other participants?
I think we can open.
So if you have any questions, please write in a chat or just ask the questions. We are a small group, so I think we can just open the discussion, and we can. So if anyone has any question, please just raise your hand or just switch on your voice, and you can just talk to us. You're welcome to do this. Petra, I see. Thank you.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Just thank you, Katya, for your presentation of your book. I would really love to read it because it's very connected to my research also. But I have a question. How you cover the period of the war? If you cover the period of Great Patriotic War in Russia or World War II, of the really beginning of the war. So this is my the question about the period, and you're covering what is your research on which period, and also about the second question about emotion. How you deal with the emotion of the people when you talk with them, and all this stuff. Thank you.
Okay, excellent questions. Yes, it's interesting how World War II is something that is almost never mentioned in the context of the Russian memory politics, especially in the popular media, right? So it's emphatically Great Patriotic War. It's it's our sacred war that becomes the focus. Of course, you cannot deny that the Soviet Union had a pact with Hitler. There was a Ribbentrop-Molotov pact, and this is something I talk about in the introduction and even the acknowledgement, that this was part of kind of the Great Awakening that people experienced, at least I did, or my peers, at the end of Perestroika, where so much information about dark spots of the Soviet past, including the war, started appearing. So we learned about the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact and how it authorized or gave permission to Stalin to invade, to annex the Baltics, that there was a Finnish war that happened before the invasion, the Nazi invasion of 1941. So these are much less sort of commemorated or even remembered parts. And for a reason, because it shows that the country, that the Soviet Union was not that much of a hero, right? Like, of course, the toll, the horrible human toll, almost 27 million people that were lost as a result of the war, is the price that the Soviet Union paid for victory. And also the Allies conceded basically parts of Europe to the Soviet Union's control. So we're still living with the reverberations of these acts, right, of these policies and all these agreements. And so I mentioned World War II as something that obviously is the context, is the historical context, but it is hardly ever commemorated. Even official digital projects that, like Memorial, which is the project of the Ministry of Defense, Minister of the Internal Affairs, and of course sanctioned by the Russian government. It's supposed to have names of all the Red Army soldiers who died in World War II. But the way that they present this information is very nebulous. Like they're not really emphasizing all the different periods of World War II. The Finnish War is definitely not, highlighted there. Although, and my own family, my grandfather's brother, Trofim, died in the Finnish War, and apparently his mother received a small pension because of that. But it's not something that we like to talk about, right? So this episode is not something that school children would be familiar with, for example. So these aspects are not completely hidden, but they're severely de-emphasized in official rhetoric, right? And so it's and of course this was something that we learned in high school, but then this was the era when all of the sort of the dark spots were being brought to light, and for a short time. Yeah. But this book mostly is concerned with the memory rather than the history writing. So I don't really spend that much time on textbooks. It's kind of a separate story of how history textbooks underwent transformation during the last 30 years in post-Soviet Russia, right? Like the 90s were the time of relative experimentation and much more revisionist kind of history that had to deal with the way that the Soviet past came under examination in the late 80s. But with Putin, we know that the textbooks are very, very geared toward the kind of the glorification of the state and creating the sense of continuity between the Soviet Union, contemporary Russia, and pre-revolutionary Russia. So there's kind of a mythical narrative there that tries to avoid talking about discontinuities. And so what was the other question? I'm sorry.
About emotion. How
emotion. Yes. So emotion is a very kind of nebulous concept, and obviously, I talk about emotional identification as a kind of like psychological response to films, for example, where you're when you're watching a melodrama, right? Like there's a kind of intended sense of compassion and pity that is evoked, and so a lot of Soviet era films that talk about sort of more intimate aspects of the war. So you have the comrades films, the films about romance. They evoke emotion of sympathy, and but while showing that their subjects are going to die. So there's a kind of heightened identification with the protagonists because we know that they will perish, right? So I'm not really, trying to do anything experimental. I think the closest I come to experiencing emotions is when I'm marching with the Immortal Regiment. So I try to kind of keep track of my own responses while also being involved. So this was a very interesting kind of position where here I was, an American academic who is, also Russian and a Russian descent and Russian upbringing. And, for the first time in decades, I'm thrust into this context. And oh my goodness, like all of these memories and affects from my childhood come to the fore. So I describe the effect of the singing of Katusha, which is like one of these patriotic songs about a young maiden who's waiting for her loved one, for her beloved, who is at the front, right? I mean, it is, as much as I had a critical distance, I could also not be completely neutral, right? So there's a kind of bodily emotional response that has to do with this kind of hidden, latent, embodied memory that I carry within me. So I think that's kind of like how motion and habit, embodiment are connected, and when an event happens that kind of shapes your affect, when you hear a song, it brings things to the fore. So that's like, it's not an ethical response, it's a somatic response, right? I would probably tell myself, well, you know better than this, but nonetheless, my body, my emotions, right? Like it's the whole person. So I think that in this chapter, I tried to show that it is very, very difficult to be completely objective, especially even for someone like me who is, a skeptic, a V-Day skeptic who is studied public memory, who is, an educated person, but still I am subjected to the same kind of effects of this event. And so I tried to take into account not just the way that symbols work, but also how environments, in a kind of a more embodied way, can affect us, and other people, the presence of other people as well.
Thank you. We have a further question in our chat from Nikita. Thank you very much, Nikita. Nikita writes, hello, thanks for the presentation. Really interesting topic. Currently doing my master's thesis on far-right parties in Europe. Has there been an example of Russia making use of these parties or other means in order to shut down or repress memory work of Russian diaspora? Any authors I could check out?
What was the last part? I'm sorry.
If there are any examples of Russia using the parties, the far-right parties, as an example for repressed memory work of Russian diaspora.
Oh, okay.
Any authors or any situations?
I'm not completely sure what is meant by the repressed memory work of Russian diaspora. I suspect, there are examples of the response of Russian speakers to the removal of statues and monuments in the Baltics, right? So this was something that kind of touched a painful spot and energized the population, the Russian-speaking population. I cannot speak to the extent to which this was a big deal, or what the demographics of this population were. So obviously there are people who are, third, fourth generation Russian speakers who live in the Baltics simply because, of the facts of history, right? Their ancestors were sent there to work in kind of industrial capacity and also be kind of the colonizers' population in those countries. So these people often identifying, especially if they're not integrated into their host countries or their new country's society, the language. So those monuments can be the source of communal identity, and so their demolition might be experienced as an assault on their identity. And we see this kind of happening as Putin is ramping up the cult of the war in Russia, and right, of course, nowadays during the invasion of Ukraine, there's also this kind of highlighting. The Russian media like to highlight how Russian speakers are being suppressed, right, or their memory work is being suppressed. So it's definitely a very weaponized subject or issue, and so and this was actually something that Alexandra asked, and she's the one who's studying the context of Estonian Russian speakers and their responses to various sites of memory, Soviet sites of memory, and so I'm afraid I'm not a good source on this. I definitely would need to do much more field work in order to answer your question. But what I want to say is that monuments and memorials are not agents of memory themselves, right? They do not remember or forget. People do. And so when we have an installation of a monument or memorial, it represents a particular point in time or the politics of that particular point in time. And then memorials can slip into some kind of obsolescence or invisibility, right? Or they could be energized by recurring rituals and so forth. And because they're no longer official rituals around those memorials, they have been embraced perhaps as more unofficial and even like resistant sites of memory, right? And so memorials take on the life of a particular community, or communities endow them with meaning through their interaction with them. And of course, this could also go on line, right? Like you could have a community that's formed online and then it is made co-present around particular dates or anniversaries and gathers around certain landmarks like memorials. So I can imagine that this could be something that really creates a charge around a removal of a monument, because it is removing a monument is a political act, right? And so I guess, whether the authorities who make this decision understand the dynamics of memory politics, or how human beings relate to memory and memorials. I think that memory is a long game in a way, and that's kind of like why I talk about habits, right? So are these people given other venues of positive identification, right? Are they integrated into the host country's culture and politics? So I know that Estonia, the Estonian Vabamu Museum, that used to be called Museum of Occupations and Freedom, but now is the Museum of Freedom, it tries to integrate the points of view of Russian speakers, Russian residents, citizens of Estonia. I'm not sure to what extent it's successful and resonates, but at least you see this kind of effort to bring the voices of people to the front, right? Like they're not ostracized, they're not suppressed. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of work ahead if we are looking toward integration and any kind of reconciliation in the future.
Thank you. Do we have any further questions in our audience? If someone would like to ask, yes, please. Nikita, do you have other question or? No, Nikita says thank you. I have some questions. If there are not other questions, I would like to ask them. You were talking about the monuments of Stalin or other monuments from the post-Soviet monuments in Russia or in other countries. I'm wondering, especially about Stalin, because we have a lot of critics period after Stalin's death. Are they still there or did they come back? Were they destroyed after Stalin's death or after in the 1990s and they came back with a Putin's memory politics, or just were still there and they are used again as a kind of memory sites?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So a lot of Stalin monuments were demolished post 1956. So most of you probably know about Khrushchev's speech that condemned the cult, Stalin's personality cult, and sort of the period of thaw that came with Khrushchev was a time when explicit references to Stalin in the form of monuments have been mostly removed from public spaces. And there is a so-called monument park in Moscow that is similar to like Grūdas Park in Lithuania to some extent, that has all these monuments that have been moved from their original places, including Dzerzhinsky statue that used to stand in front of the FSB or KGB building in Lubyanka. And so there is one Stalin monument there that is used as a kind of artifact, right? It's just kind of as a cultural remnant, so to speak. But so whatever statues of Stalin have appeared in the Putin era are new. They're mostly new statues. There are some museums. And so they are kind of presented as local initiatives, right? So like people wanted to erect the statue. So they're presented as by popular demand kind of thing. And what I find also interesting is that how Stalin has been integrated into pop culture, right? And it's perhaps more disturbing than actual monuments because that signals that people are comfortable with the idea of Stalin as a kind of pocket-sized dictator. So in the book, I discuss some of the examples of the sort of commercial culture where you have, instead of matryoshkas, the nesting dolls, you have patryoshkas, with Putin being the biggest patryoshka, and then in descending order, you have the other Soviet leaders all the way down to the last czar, so the czar is inside Lenin, who killed them, right? And so there's a kind of idea of continuity, and Stalin, because of the descending order, he's actually pretty tiny. And of course, Stalin was not a very tall man to begin with, but here we have the sense of, like, I try to think about this, and I found the work on kitsch very, very useful in this way, because kitsch is something that does not have this sort of grand appearance, right? It's not overwhelming, it's not monumental, but it is something that communicates, one, that there's a kind of cozy acceptability about this character, of this person. And two, that this is something that is widely popular, right? So there's a kind of a double prong rhetorical effect of kitsch, because it sort of says that, oh, hey, isn't this great? And this is so non-threatening and so kind of cool, right? Almost. And two is that if you have disagreement with this representation, you're in the minority. So the Stalin kitsch that circulates in tourist commercial spaces is something that I find like particularly interesting and also disturbing. And of course, I should mention the flags that are often carried on May 9th, during May 9th parades that say thank you to grandfather for the victory, with Stalin on the banner, right? So it's a kind of unabashed representation of A, Stalin on the victory banner, and B, also kind of putting him as a kind of, familial, in familial terms. So he's considered to be the grandfather, right? The national grandfather. So Putin is the father, Stalin is the grandfather. And so this is kind of the everyday turn, as Lisa calls it, or that Field calls it, is something that I think is part and parcel of the resurrection of Stalin, of Stalin's image as a particular kind of leader. So that may not have anything in common with the historical Stalin. And so that kind of easy acceptability of that image in public culture and commercial spaces everywhere is what really makes it so pernicious.
And if we don't have any other questions, I have one question more, or I have a lot of questions, but I would like to ask one more question. You told us that the people are trying not to remember the terror because it's something that is not worth remembering, or it has this can it bring you in trouble again, even though we had this short time when it was normal to talk about. But we have, in many countries, we have topics we want to remember or we want to forget. In Germany, we have, for example, this famous grandpa wasn't a Nazi. All the people want to not remember the grandparents or parents being a part of the Nazi regime. So when you talk to the people, it's hard to find someone who had Nazis in the family, even though there was a big support for a Nazi regime during the period. Also in Poland, we have a problem when you are talking to people, even though we have a lot of anti-Semitism in Poland, even today, without having Jews living there. When you're talking to people, we had a lot of people supporting Jews during the war. What was like about 3% of population, I think. But if you're talking, almost everyone was supporting someone in kind of a way. So we want to join the part of being heroes, not be, yeah. And if you are remembering communism in Poland or Nazi regime in Poland, everyone want to be a victim of the regime. No, not collaborating, not working for it. So even either you're a victim or you're a hero fighting against. But I think is this the difference about trying to forget the terrorism in Russia, the same terrorism, because we are talking about communism, because it was a kind of self-made terrorism, and for Poland it's something that was foreign terrorism. So we are talking about communists. They are kind of traitors of Poland, and in Russia you can consider such many people as traitors of Russia, because there were also the same people fighting Nazis. Maybe it's the problem I'm just thinking about, because it's easier for Polish memory just to take, okay, the communism was bad because it was never was a part of Poland. What is not true either, but do you think it could be the kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that part of the difficulty of remembering victims of Soviet political terror is that oftentimes perpetrators became victims in the next round of repressions. And Alexandra Etkin wrote a book called Warped Mourning about kind of the incomplete and also warped nature of remembrance of Soviet political terror. It's so much harder to come to grips with what happened if your great grandfather was both a perpetrator and a victim, right? Like, how do we tell stories about this, like, and what do we do with this fact, right? And I think that's the task that I think to this day has been unresolved. We are lacking the language. We're lacking the ways of mourning and remembrance that would give us kind of a way to do it, right, in an acceptable way. And I think that's kind of part of the silent or ashamed silence that characterizes, for example, the families of Nazis, right, or Nazi participants in the Nazi project, because they'd rather not talk about it. And in Russia, there is a fear about, still lingering fear about publicizing the fact that your relative was repressed. And during the Soviet era, for like several decades after Stalin's death, you could still get in trouble or not get a promotion or admission to an educational establishment if you admitted that you had a relative. And so people would actually like scratch the picture of their family members from the family photograph, for example, right? However, it's kind of like there are lots of stories of how in the same family lineage, you would have both the perpetrators and the victims, right? So in this way, as Ed can put it, Soviet terror was suicidal. If in Nazi Germany, you could kind of see a clear delineation between the victims and the perpetrators, here it's not so clear. Although I think even in Germany, so filmmakers like Petzold have dealt with this kind of familial issue where perpetrator and victim were actually husband and wife, right? The movie Phoenix is a very good text that kind of problematizes this clear distinction. So I think it's a question that pushes us to think in ethical terms rather than simply terms of piety, that we would like perhaps to find an easy way to do to remember that would be socially acceptable, that would be something that will make us feel good about ourselves. But I think that this is kind of something that commemoration of Soviet terror is problematic, or not problematic, but challenging, right? And I think we're still trying to find the language for that.
I was just wondering if it's got worse at the moment because Putin needs those perpetrators as heroes. You have the same situation in Cambodia, but they don't need Khmer Rouge anymore as the heroes. So you can just say, okay, the whole nation is a kind of victim because of the system, even though they were perpetrators. But I think that could be this next is because he needs them as heroes again. So being perpetrators will be problematic at the moment.
Yeah, I think there has been a rehabilitation of the sort of the class of KGB, FSB, security class as a whole, both historically and in contemporary context, because you see some like television series that create this character. And of course, like Stieglitz was kind of like external, like, yeah, he's the hero of the Soviet Union, right? Like popular hero of the Soviet Union. So and Putin himself tried to, or his political technologists tried to style him as kind of our Stierlitz, who, you know, is dashing and speaks German and so smart and, you know, everything. So there has been this rehabilitation of the image of the Chekist, I think, in popular imagination through all sorts of popular culture vehicles. And yeah, and like, you know, if contemporary security services see themselves as descendants of those of this class, yeah, they would probably be interested in downplaying the role of security services in the purges. And in fact, this has been happening both implicitly and explicitly. And so now there's a push to de-rehabilitate some of the Soviet terror victims, right? Like whole categories are now being reconsidered for removal of the rehabilitation status. And so it's an ongoing and you know, important site. So yeah, it's not in the past. The past is not in the past.
Yeah. I would like to ask the last time if we have any questions from the audience. It's the last call for other questions, because if we don't have any, I thank you very much. I would like to thank you very, very much. I found it was really interesting for me, because I'm also working in this area. So it was a lot of new ideas or new impulses for my own research. Thank you very much. Thank you for the audience for joining us and listening to the conversation, to this discussion. And yeah, I would like to invite you to watch our other seminars that will come normally every first Monday of the, sometimes the third Monday of the month, depending on the situation. And yes, thank you very much and have a nice evening. And we will see each other soon, I hope.
Thanks so much for having us. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Alina. Thank you, Daria. Thank you, Sasha. Hope you can see this at some point.